Today I'm talking about a topic that on one hand is very simple and on the other hand is extremely nuanced and layered and dare I say convoluted. I'm talking about worship. So I grew up in a church that had a pretty mainstream evangelical worship. We sang Chris Tomlin and Bethel, yikes, and Hillsong, double yikes, and all the other classic worship bands that go on tour and fill arenas, and their songs are on the Christian music charts and whatnot. And in my experience with worship, I have been to probably hundreds of events, Sunday services and Wednesday services and summer camps and spring camps and fall camps and never winter camps and worship retreats and men's retreats and on and on and on. And it was pretty common at these events to see people fall down in worship and raise their hands and jump around and cry and even on occasion speak in tongues. And I know that there are probably some of you watching uh, who you've experienced the jumping and the crying and the falling down and the speaking in tongues, and it triggers you. You were part of a world where you were hurt by people who then went on to worship in these ways, and these things became tied and became connected in your brain, and so you hear about people speaking in tongues or crying or falling down or jumping up during worship, and it just makes you feel gross. Likewise, I know that there are probably at least a few of you out there who are watching this, and maybe you haven't grown up in church, but you've read articles and you've listened to academics and podcasts, and you know that there are credible and qualified and intelligent behaviorists and sociologists and psychologists who will say that evangelical worship expressions are all explainable through social pressures and social conditionings, and when people say they're feeling the spirit, these academics would argue that instead they're just kind of under the influence of strong suggestibility, almost like when you go see a hypnotist. It's peer pressure and expectations and internal desires. And so you raise your hand and you speak in tongues and you jump up and down and you fall on the ground and you cry, but none of it is an evidence of a greater spirit. And at the same time, I know that there are some people who are watching this who live in a world where they worship in this way. To see someone raise their hands or jump up and down or fall on the ground or even speak in tongues, it isn't weird or out of the ordinary or bad in any way to them. Maybe you yourself do this when you worship. To you, it's good. To you, it's the evidence of the Spirit because you felt the Spirit as you've worshipped in this way. So, what I'm trying to get at and what I'm trying to say is that if you're here because you want me to affirm your doubts about worship, you want me to go, humbug, all that worship stuff is nonsense. This isn't the right video. And likewise, if you think I'm going to sit here and talk about how the way the church in the US worships is right, I'm not. There's a lot about how churches choose to worship in the West that doesn't sit right with me. What I want to do is give my points of view, my experience, and I hope that if I share my experience with worship, that maybe something about it will connect with you and can be a resource to help you in your journey or the way you think about worship. And so, my very first thought, when I really want to try and sum up all of my thoughts about worship music, what strikes me more than anything is when you really stack up a worship song next to just about any other secular music, worship music is just not good. And I know that someone is watching this and mad at me right now. And like, sorry, but like, The Christian church is the only place so polite and earnest that we would take a song like Days of Elijah and make it a super hit. The longer I was in the church, the longer I was an active participant in worship services, the more things felt off. I slowly began to realize that there were just like a million sort of unspoken, universally agreed upon rules of worshiping that no one seemed to talk about, like what to do with your hands while you're worshiping. I would be worshiping and I would go, oh, should my hands be up, raised in prayer and worship? But how high should my hands be? Should they be at my chest like this, or should they be stretched out like this, or maybe just fully up? I don't want to look like I don't want to look fake, but I also don't want to look like I'm bragging in my worship, but I also don't want to look like a heathen who isn't getting into worship. Oh, what do I do? And it's not like it's necessarily wrong. It's just strange, and this led to other observations on my part, like how the content of worship songs feels so tribal. The world is always just so neatly split into the Christians and the non-Christians, us and them, and there's so much talk about how horrible we are. Half the songs are about how we're sinners and we're worms and we're worthless, but God is so good that God loves even a disgusting, dirty worm like me, and somehow that's supposed to lift my soul to worship. And why does it all sound the same? Have you ever noticed this? It just sounds the same, like watered down adult contemporary. And why is that the genre that they chose to make worship music in? Does God have some sort of secret desire to hear breathy voiced women and growly voiced men? And some of this is silly. I'll admit it. Like it's not bad per se. It's just strange. But it did have the effect as time went on of chipping away at something that had felt so pure, so holy, so organic when I was younger. And that began to lead to some bigger questions, like does God need this? Us singing forever about God to God? People talk about the idea that heaven is a place where we go and get to sing God's praises all day and all night, 24/7, just singing God's praises. And I've always been like, all day and like nothing else, no food, drinks, games, laughter, hugs, nothing, no late night shawarma. I mean, what was the point of God making Mediterranean delis that are open at 1 a.m. if that isn't going to exist in heaven? I, you know, I was a youth pastor for a number of years, and I can remember we were having a discussion one night about heaven and about kind of this topic, and the idea of we'll only ever sing God's praises 24/7 kind of came up, and a student asked, like, so nothing here on earth that makes life good, not even the things that God created, are going to be in heaven. It's just singing. That kind of sounds like torture. That sounds like hell. And all I could do was kind of go, yeah, that does kind of sound torturous. You're not wrong. What sort of God demands that? You also start to notice that there's so much emotional manipulation that goes on in worship today. The goosebumps. I don't know, if you've ever been to a camp or something, the goosebumps became equated with God. The amount of youth camps I went to where the worship leader, the pastor would say, do you have the goosebumps right now? That's God. You're feeling God. Which, no, that doesn't line up with anything. There's this old worship leader, Rich Mullins, who kind of bucked against the system a little bit in his day. There's this famous story from along, his time. Someone came up to him after, a worship night type thing and said, "Oh, and that one song during the bridge, I really felt the spirit move." And Mullins famously responded, "Oh, no, that wasn't the spirit. That's where the kick drums come in." But not to mention that there's also just so much ego and so much of worship today. You have all these churches who spend hours upon hours talking about church growth and how to get more people getting to the church because more people means more money, and more money means, optimistically, more money means more money for charities and projects that enrich the community and helping people's lives. And pessimistically, more money for churches means, oh, we can expand the parking lot so even more people can come, and we can build an even taller steeple so you can see us from further away. And more money means we can spend more on advertising so even more people can hear about us. And, even more pessimistically than that, more money for a church can mean, oh, the pastor gets to buy a second jumbo jet. At the center of just about any conversation about church growth is worship. You have good worship, your church is probably going to grow. That and a good kids program. Those are just like the two things you need, and you're doing okay. Like you've reached C plus territory. But if you've ever had any part in the work behind the scenes at a church, you'll know that worship is often talked a lot about like a marketing tool, like a fishing net to draw people in, like the face of a book trying to convince you to read it. But more than just the behind the scenes ego boost of worship, what about the during the actual church service? You put the musicians front and center. Maybe you have special lights that are just for the worship service, and maybe even a spotlight, and maybe you even have a fog machine, and everyone's looking forward. And yeah, we're supposed to be looking at the screen, at the words, and singing the words. But on occasion, their eyes fall on the worship team, and at least once every now and then, someone in the congregation looks at the people on the worship team on the stage and they go, those people are cool. So many churches have turned their worship leaders into rock stars, and we are living in an age where a good amount of big worship leaders have gotten semi famous and have gone on to act kind of like rock stars. And I know that there's a sort of irony of talking about look at me, church worship culture, while you literally look at me, but we'll get there another week, I promise. But all of this is before we get to like the strangest stuff at all, like the worship industrial complex, the millions and millions of dollars that flies all around the world as people write and produce hits for Jesus. The fact that on multiple occasions worship albums enter into mainstream music charts near the top. It's a big business, and big business begets people whose sole job is to make sure that business stays good, stays big. So they track the trends and they search for artists who fit the look and the sound, and they throw money at them to make something with the few keywords that are trending in the zeitgeist of Christian circles and online. And boom, you have a hit. You have 20 people in suits meeting in a boardroom telling an artist what they need to do to be more popular. And did you notice how little I talked about Jesus in that whole description of the Christian music worship scene? It's almost like talking about this ancient tradition that teaches us to be in the world and not of it, and then that marrying into a capitalistic system, which is very much in the world, perverted what was supposed to be holy and special and made it all about money. Imagine that. It's the fact that 3 years ago there was a famous worship leader who toured the country hosting what he called praise protests during the height of lockdown and quarantine, and when the world was screaming for justice over the murder of George Floyd. He traveled to inner city areas where he didn't know anyone, while Christian leaders who lived in those areas begged him not to come, and he called them heathens and charlatans. Literally, he called my spouse, the mother of my child, a thug. And if you know Justine, you know how ridiculous that is. And he questioned if every single one of these people actually even believed in God for asking him not to come. And for his troubles, he accepted donations, and he even sold t shirts that said, Jesus Christ super spreader during a global pandemic. and a hefty amount of that money went into his bank account. And somehow millions of Christians believed that it was worship because he said he was singing to Jesus. Now, I know that I am painting with a harsh brush, and I apologize to an extent. And we won't stay here, but we have to start here because for so many of us, we've experienced some of what I just talked about. Maybe you've experienced all of it, and it changed how we experience and how we interact with worship music. I can remember one point a few years ago, I was at a worship event and I was in the congregation, and I just felt icky. And I looked around me at all the people I was with, and I looked at the people on the stage, and I just felt like I had this black gunk inside of me. I actually began to feel panicky, and I had to disengage. I had to leave. I stayed out in the back hallway for the entirety of the worship night, just trying to calm down because it just felt wrong. And for years afterwards, that feeling would come over me every now and then when I heard certain songs. Just like a panicky feeling in my chest, the desire to leave, the heavy, gunky crud that felt like it was spreading over me the longer I stayed. Like the song and the event was infecting me, and I couldn't figure it out. What was it about this that held me back? What had changed in me? Now, when Scripture describes worship, specifically musical worship, it does so in a bit of an unexpected way. Revelations 4 describes this larger than life imagery and language. The book of Revelations was written in an ancient genre that is called apocalyptic literature, which sounds scarier than it really is. Apocalyptic literature was meant to pull back the veil between the physical and the spiritual realms, uncover something going on in our world as kind of a dominant power, but then also shed a light that this thing actually is not an ultimate power. Apocalyptic literature removes that thin line between the physical and the spiritual and kind of shows us what our world really actually looks like when viewed in a mythical, metaphysical, eternal context. And so I'm going to read a bit from the scriptures, and I want to encourage you as you listen to the text. Don't try and figure it out. Let it wash over you. Let your imagination grab onto it and try and run. So I had to grab my Bible, but try and picture the imagery. Try to understand this as metaphor and mythic, but therefore as true, as even more true than simple physical facts can reveal. There's something deeply powerful about this depiction of worship in Revelations 4. After this, I looked, and there in heaven a door stood open. And the first voice I heard, which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne, with one seated on the throne. And the one seated there looks like jasper and cornelian, and around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders, dressed in white, robes with golden crowns on their heads. Coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And in front of the throne, there is something like a sea of glass, like crystal. Around the throne and on each side of the throne are 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature like a face like a human being, and the fourth living creature like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and inside. Day and night without ceasing, they sing, "Holy, holy, holy, the Lord God, the Almighty, who was and is to come." And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to the one who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, The 24 elders fall before the one who is seated on the throne and worship the one who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, singing, "You are worthy, our Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Don't know why I grabbed my Bible. It's on my screen. There's so much I could say about a text like that, but the one thing I want to pull out of it is that creation will always worship. We are built to give something that center place. As Bob Dylan saying, you gotta serve somebody. And if that thing is not God, is not the creator, is not the breath of the world, is not the spark, the universe, the engine that is moving everything forward, then things are going to get a little wonky, a little crooked, a little messed up. I think there is a stereotype of worship songs sounding like love songs. Sometimes people call them Jesus is my boyfriend songs. And that stereotype, definitely true, and I hate it. But have you ever heard like a love song that kind of sounds like a worship song? The most famous example of this, obviously, is that Hosier song from forever ago. But in his case, he did it intentionally. There's a dark, brooding Irish Catholic melancholy, and he infuses Christian imagery into his songs about romance. And but I've heard songs where I don't think the songwriters meant to make it sound like a worship song, but in trying to communicate just how much they love this person, they begin to worship them. And every time I hear a song like this, it just kind of wigs me out. Hearing like, "You're perfect, you can do no wrong. I worship the ground you walk on. I want to be baptized in your riverbanks. You cleanse me of all my demons." Like me? I do that? No, thank you. Like, no, thank you. Can you imagine if your partner or your spouse sat you down and sang this song to you? Like, it's a little intense. Can you imagine the pressure? It would ruin the relationship to put the person you love most in the center place. You can't put anything else in that center space because it was made for something bigger, something deeper, something older, something wiser, something truer than just some other person. And if you put a person in the center, it is going to eventually bend and break under the weight and the pressure that comes with being in the center. But people do this all the time. We put our spouses in the center, we put our children in the center. Ever know parents who think the sun rises and falls on their kids? Ugh, they're the most annoying parents in the world, and they raise the most annoying kids in the world. And then when their kids undoubtedly do mess up and prove that they're not the divine beings their parents thought they were, oh my god, all hell breaks loose. Literally, hell breaks loose. And it doesn't end there. We do this with friends. We do this with works, politicians, politics. I'll even up the ante. How many people have put church in the center? How many people have put Christians, either specific Christian people or just Christians in general? Or even how many people put Christianity in the center, religion? If you want my unfiltered and authentic thoughts, which if you're watching this, that's why you're here, I would argue that most of the systemic, horrific, awful, painful abuse and pain and horror that has taken place inside this faith tradition has been because people mistake God for the church, or mistake God for Christianity, or mistake God for what their pastor says on a Sunday. But none of that is actually God. And don't get me wrong, it's all good things. All of that is good. Maybe not politicians. I mean, I don't know if I know a good politician, but friends, work, spouse, kids, church, faith, religion, it's all fine, it's all good, but it is not God. It is not the source. It's not the actual thing at the center of it all. All these things crumble, all these things become distorted when and if we put them in the center where only the creator is supposed to go. in the center of our hearts, in the center of our minds, in the center of everything. We have to acknowledge that there is something more to all of this here, that there is an undercurrent rippling through all of it, weaving it together. The center of all the cosmos, the center of our hearts, the center of our being is for something bigger, for something more real than just this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, 20th century theologian who died in a concentration camp, wrote about how idealized Christian community can become the enemy of true Christian community. You know, we get these ideas in our heads that our Christian community has to be perfect, perfectly full of justice and righteousness, and how everyone should be perfectly kind and humble and educated. But no, they're just people. They're just a community. It's your kids, it's your spouse, it's your partner, it's your work, it's your friends, it's that dream you have, it's your community, it's your church. It's good. Don't get me wrong. It's so good. It's just not perfect. So don't put them in the center. So, how does this all fit together? Great question. Here's what I know, and here's how it connects to Revelation 4. God doesn't demand our worship like an egomaniac. You know, that's what a bad guy does in a James Bond movie or something. God isn't just a bigger person, like a big version of us. No, I think the calls to worship God in Scripture is because when anything else but the Creator is in the center, things start to fall apart because something has to be in the center. But when the Creator is at the center of our hearts, the center of our lives, everything finds its proper place around the throne. Another way to put that is when the spark is in the center of reality, then the universe falls into harmony with itself. Creation is free to be wild and diverse. Others are freed of our expectations of them, and they can become living beings. We are liberated from our endless desire to control everything and impress everyone. Creation only comes to life when it is open and receptive of the Creator at the center of the cosmos. Now, there are ways that we can put God at the center, many ways that we can worship. Worship has a lot of modern connotations to it, but worship at its core, it means, its definition is where you put your worth. And there are many ways we can show. Sorry, I just messed up my hair. Who cares? But there's so many ways we can show that what we value most is God. We can love others. We can fight injustice. We can do what is right. We can walk in humility. And all of that is worship. Music is just one part of this. In fact, the prophets actually warned the people not to sing to God, thinking that it would cover over their injustice. That if they're perpetuating injustice, if we are in perpetuating injustice, then God does not want to hear our songs. You can go to Amos chapter 5 for that, and I recommend you do. I love me some Amos personally. But since those in the Christian tradition, those who are followers of the way, as it was called long before it became this big institutionalized religion it is today, since we often think of worship as full of music, I'm going to offer a few ways that I think music can put God in the center and put us in our rightful place. First, worship music moves us. No matter the context, no matter the situation, worship music can move us. It can move our souls if we allow it to emotionally manipulate us. And it sounds weird, but music simply is emotional manipulation. It just is. When you're at a funeral, you play sad songs, but you don't play Elliott Smith on your way to the club unless you're Justine. That's not how it works. You know, watch a Pixar movie and wait for an emotionally devastating scene like when the old man's wife dies from Up. Listen to the music. They're not playing the Benny Hill theme. Music was given to us by the Creator to draw us deeper into our emotions. And those emotions can include loving and trusting the Creator. But emotional manipulation is dangerous when churches and camps and events equate goosebumps to the presence of God. But if we say to ourselves and we acknowledge that music is designed to give us emotional responses to things, and those emotional responses can be drawing us deeper into God's presence, then suddenly it doesn't become emotional manipulation in a negative sense, but suddenly it becomes a tool to help us engage on an emotive level that with God that is always present with us. Sometimes when the world just feels like a little too much, and you feel like you're overwhelmed or maybe even disconnected from the universe, from God, from the source, just try listening to music. I like to go into my room, turn off the lights, and just sit with my eyes closed and listen to music. And the music doesn't even have to be like Christian worship music. Listen, it doesn't even have to be overtly spiritual music. There's a plethora of music that when I hear it, it connects me with something inside of myself and outside of myself and all around myself. It connects me with the divine, with the source of all things. Personally, I love listening to jazz music. There's this album by Duke Ellington and John Coltrane that I think makes me feel closer to God than any worship album ever has. The opening track, "In a Sentimental Mood," came on shuffle one time when I was driving a little bit ago, and I found myself crying in my car, praising God, like out of nowhere. I was driving to the grocery store or something, like totally normal day. It's my phone's on shuffle. The song comes on, and I'm just worshiping God. Like I think the song before it was "God Save the Queen" by the Ramones, and the song that came on after it was "Get Jiggy with It" by Will Smith. But suddenly, for 4 minutes, I was in the presence of the divine, bowing in the throne room of heaven. Listen to music that pulls you deeper into spirit, music that lifts the veil and separates the physical from the spiritual, and just let yourself sink into it. Whatever the music is, turn off the lights, settle into the space, let your mind meditate and maybe even wander if it needs to, but meditate on God's love for you, God's embrace of you, God's acceptance of who you are and your place in the world, that you are here on purpose. Allow God to give you hope in that time. Is it emotional manipulation? Of course it is, but you're in on it. It helps. I find it helps give me hope in my weakness. The weight of the world is real. I imagine for a lot of you watching this, you feel like your life is tearing apart at the seams. And if you're at the center of your world, that's a real problem because then your world is being torn apart at the seams, and it's up to you to hold it all together. Sounds exhausting. But if you accept that there is a creator, there is a source, there's something divine at the center of it all, if we put that spark in the center, we find that God can hold all of our pain, all of our worry, all of our sorrow. And suddenly it's okay to be vulnerable. It's even okay to be weak. You don't have to hold it all together because someone else is holding all things together. So remind yourself, you're not the center. Put on some music with all your weakness and all your frailty. Join in with the song that the angels and the animals and creation is already singing. And my next point might be a stretch for a lot of people, especially if you're dealing with and talking about people who have been hurt by institutional religion. But worship music unites us. Worship and worship music, it isn't about those who are singing it. It's not even about those of us who are leading. It's about the creator on the throne and how I personally can take my place in the worship circle. I intentionally haven't mentioned this yet, but for years I was heavily invested in the worship at my church. I played on the worship team nearly every Sunday in one capacity or another from the time I was in middle school until I was 26, 27. I mean, I'm talking close to 15 years straight. I was getting on stage to worship, oftentimes leading worship front and center. And even when I was having my anxiety attacks while at other worship events. And yet, I didn't feel all that anxious when I would be on a worship team. In fact, I often felt pretty close to God, and I gave myself over to what I can only describe as authentic worship. And now you can argue that it's my own ego, and I already warned about ego, that I needed myself to be on stage front and center in some way to feel good about the offering of worship, but I don't think that was it. Because there would be Sundays where I wouldn't be up on stage on worship team or anything, and I'd be in the congregation and I felt at peace. I didn't feel that icky, gross, gunky feeling inside of myself. I didn't feel anxious or panicky or like I needed to leave the room. I think it was because I knew the people on stage. I grew up in this church, and I grew up in, and I pastored at a small church. I knew the people who led worship. I was close to the people who led worship. I knew that when they sang, there was nothing in their hearts other than an earnest desire to draw close to God. It wasn't to make more money. They often weren't being paid. It wasn't to be in the spotlight. I knew in my heart when I would lead worship, and I knew their heart because I knew them, and it allowed me to feel at ease. I felt like the one space I could be assured that no one was trying to manufacture or force spirituality on me, but there was just humble people trying to search for the source and grow and meet with the Creator together. So I have a lot of empathy for people who struggle to sing or those who feel uncomfortable when they find themselves in places of worship because I still do often, like a lot. Let me just tell you from experience, and this is my personal experience, it is possible to become so critical and judgmental of how others are singing that we fail to join in the singing ourselves. And it can create, in my experience, it can create in me the same ego and pride and judgment that I am, in theory, pushing against. This is the last thing I'll say. Few years ago, there was this big worship event in Minneapolis. It advertised itself as a cross-denominational time of prayer and worship, and it seemed kind of like a small thing. It didn't get a lot of hype, but people from multiple different backgrounds and ethnicities and denominations and theological thought were going to come together to praise God. And for whatever reason, either lack of anything better to do, or maybe it was the blowing of the holy wind at my back, I decided to go. And I was in this old church, this ornate and beautifully crafted building, and the worship starts, and it's fine. It's good, The people all around, all these pastors and ministers from all these different congregations throughout the city are worshiping and praising, and I'm trying to move past my hangups and my baggage, and and then a very popular worship song comes on, and it has this lyric that just has always rubbed me the wrong way. And the lyric is, "You didn't want heaven without us, so Jesus, you brought heaven down." And immediately in my head, I thought to myself, "That is so stupid. It's stupid. Jesus didn't come for me as an individual. Jesus didn't come to earth to be like, I need no. He came for the whole cosmos. The things in the things in eschatological mess. It promotes escapism instead of the reconciliation of all things to God's perfect love and justice." And I was ranting and I was raving in my head and I was folding my arms and probably audibly sighing in the middle of this echoey church. And I heard in my head so clearly, one of the only times I have ever heard God audibly, and the voice of God said to me, "Brennan, don't be an asshole." Heaven and earth had collided and had put God at the center of a beautiful, diverse group of people, all of whom were authentically seeking to draw deeper and meet with this creator. And I was being too much of a freshman theology student to get over the fact that it wasn't perfect. I was too critical to join their faithful song of praise. This has led me to reflect on one of the first things you learn when you do cross cultural work. I went to 1 year at a university, and While there, I took a class on how to meet and talk with people of different cultures respectfully and lovingly. And one of the things the professor said to us in the class was, no matter what, when you go into someone's home, you must eat what is put before you. You must eat what is put before you. At your own home, you can be a bit pickier. It's your own home. You can have certain preferences and things you like to stay clear from, and that's all fine and good. When I'm at home, I am very appreciative when no one puts olives in my food. Don't like it. And when I make dinner, I'm more than happy to try and do my best to make sure I don't add food they don't like. When I'm a guest, when I'm a guest in another church, another community, another gathering, I think to myself, you have to eat what you're given. You might not like it. In fact, you probably won't like it. And it's not going to be prepared the way you'd prefer it to be prepared. And maybe even if you know that your way is the better way, but you're not eating it because you like it. You're eating as a sign of hospitality. And since that day at that old church, I've had this sort of phrase, an expression, a mantra, if you will, that I keep, in my soul when I leave my home to go somewhere else. I say to myself, worship hospitality. When I enter into spaces where the music or the lyrics or the people leading the worship seems suspect, I say to myself, worship hospitality. It gives me the opportunity to exercise muscles of humility, to remind myself that worship isn't about me. It's not about the lyrics or the song or the music, and it's especially not about the people leading the song. It's about finding my spot around the throne. Worship hospitality is a wonderful opportunity to kill my ego, my controlling nature, my judgments. Worship hospitality allows me to surrender all I don't understand or agree with, from the lyrics to the people singing them, and just hand it all over to the God who can be trusted to hold all things. So at that event, in that grand old church in Minneapolis, after God so lovingly called me out, and it's truly word for word, I looked around the room and I saw the people there, how they came from all over, all different backgrounds, different worldviews, different communities, different nationalities, different theologies, different ages, and how they had all come together to worship around the throne, to find their place and sing together. And there was no way that I was going to be the one who broke that circle of worship. So right then and there on the spot, I repented. And as a sign of my repentance, I raised my hands and my head, and I sang as loud and as passionately as I ever have, and with all authenticity and openness. So I hope this helps. I hope this helped. I hope if I did my job right, I pissed everyone off equally. Everyone has something to gripe about, I would hope. Perfect. But if this was beneficial or meaningful to you, you can always comment down below, reach out, find me at the Co-Mutual on Instagram to go a little more in depth. I've said this before, and I don't remember if I've said this in other places, but I'm on this quest to talk about, is Christianity still worth it? Going through the core foundations of what makes up this faith tradition that we call Christianity, and seeing the way we do it now, is that worth it, or is there something truer, something better, something holier, something more real out there? And so I do these videos from time to time when I can. I just noticed that, as I've said a lot of times, and I think is a really important thing, the point of these is to not be the final word. I'm not trying to tell you what you have to think or believe or feel. But a sermon or a message, the best of them is to be the first word, to start a spark in your heart, in your mind, It gets you thinking, gets you speaking, gets you feeling, gets you journaling or processing emotions or thoughts, so that you can come to a place where you decide where you land and how you feel. It's to try and get movement started. So this is not the final word, but the first word. And if you have follow-ups or questions or want to go deeper or talk more, talk about something else, reach out, talk to me. I'm always up for that. And grace, peace, cheers.